Okay, now let's take a look at how to best stretch the hamstring muscles. Of all the stretches that most athletes do, hamstring stretches probably are paramount. For runners, they're probably the key stretch that most runners do. For other athletes, if they're involved in running, then we get the same thing. A lot of hamstring flexibility. Even bodybuilders, powerlifters, hamstring flexibility. So the hamstrings appear to be a culprit in many injuries. So therefore we do more and more stretching. Now notice how we equated the two. Because they are so frequently injured, we say, well, we have to stretch them more. But yet there's no correlation between the stretching and prevention of injury. There is a correlation between the strength and the neuromuscular aspect, the technique. Most hamstring injuries are caused because of technique, not because of muscle tightness, not because of muscle laxity, but because of the technique involved in running, for example, or cutting actions, or even in some other activity where the hamstrings are involved strongly. So we have to address the technique aspect. But back to the stretching. When we do stretching, we typically don't want to just stretch for the sake of stretching. We want to stretch and strengthen simultaneously. Getting more and more flexibility or range of motion in a joint without concurrent strength over that range of motion. Recall, if you're strong, your strength is really different at every angle, at every point in that range of motion. So just because you increase your range of motion does not mean you now have strength there. You have to develop strength in this newfound range of motion. So this is why the stretch should include some element of resistance so that you can also gain strength. Which brings us to the method. The best method is dynamic. See, in dynamic you can develop strength together with flexibility. But if it's passive stretching, now we're only looking to increase range of motion. And the more we do the passive stretching, not only increasing range of motion, but we're also stretching the ligaments. This is where the problem occurs. And yet, this is the most recommended type of stretching for runners and other athletes when it comes to the hamstrings. Show me a runner who doesn't do any passive hamstring stretching. It's rare. You're starting to change today, though, which is good. And if there's anything, after you get done listening to me here, if you will change your method and get rid of all of this passive flexibility stretching, you will be on your way to greater safety and better performances for the hamstrings. But yet, here we find, even in running magazines, articles devoted to hamstring stretching with passive stretching. And it's getting to the point where not only do you just stretch it one way, like for example, the standing toe touch or the seated toe touch, two of the more popular types of stretches for the hamstring. Or let's say for runners, they put their foot up on a table or on a post or a beam or something like that, and then they lean over to touch it. This is analogous to the seated hamstring stretch. These are terrible stretches. And why do I say terrible? Because they stretch the heck out of the ligaments in your lower back. They're not very effective for stretching the hamstrings. You got to go through an extreme range of motion before you feel it in the hamstrings. In other words, you're stretching the heck out of your lower back before the hamstrings kick in to get stretched. Like in a standing toe touch, when you're bending all the way over, you are literally hanging by the ligaments because the muscles relax. See, the lower back is especially interesting here. When you bend over or you do an activity through a certain range, the muscles kick in to hold you there and to guide you. But after about 45 degrees, and it varies a little bit here, as you're bending over, the muscles relax. And then you wind up hanging by the ligaments. So the more you're hanging by the ligaments, the more you're stretching them. And the more you're stretching those ligaments, the looser the lower back you're getting. And it becomes more prone to injury. So I hear of many runners complaining of bad backs. Well, it could be due to the stretching or improper technique. So take your choice. So anyway, you don't want the bent over toe touch stretch. You don't want the seated toe touch stretch. Both of these stretch the heck out of the lower back. But yet, they're still highly recommended. Other stretches, they're becoming even more sophisticated. Well, if you hold your legs real wide, now we can get the inner hamstring, or we can get the outer hamstring. Well, typically at the hip joint, they're all in the same spot. They insert, right next to one another. So you're not really going to isolate one or the other. But be that as it may, I'm just using it to show the extremes that we're going to get complete stretching of this muscle, or more and more stretching of it, as opposed to more strengthening. See, the good morning exercise is excellent. Here you're going to get some stretching on the way down, and you're going to get some strengthening on the way up. So do a good morning. I'm sure you're going to find, and if you keep the back arched, then you will find the hamstrings kick in almost immediately. You're not going to be able to touch your toes. If you can touch your toes, holding your back in an arched position, then you have a flexibility that could put you in a circus. That's going way beyond what is normal. So, at any rate, do more dynamic stretching for the hamstrings, as well as for other muscles. Get away from some of the more common exercises that are done for stretching the hamstrings, like the seated toe touch and the bent over toe touch. These are highly dangerous exercises. But do stretches that are really going to target it, and then ask yourself, if you're a runner, how much flexibility do you really need? When in the world do you ever touch your toes when you're running? When do you even come close to touching your toes? What's the main recommendation given in running with good form? Run erect. If you're running erect, why do we need all of this flexibility? Most long distance runners, you're not bringing the thigh forward more than about 45 degrees. So how much flexibility do you need in that hip joint? Very little. Show me people who can't raise their leg at least 45 degrees with ease. Can't find them. See, that's very simple. So, how much do you need? Do dynamic stretching. Stretch the muscle to prepare it for action. That's going to be the key. And relax it when needed. Otherwise, you're wasting more time. And it was interesting, some of these articles say, only 10 minutes, only 10 minutes. Hey, 10 minutes that could be devoted to running. We all complain of not having enough time. Well, there's one way to save time. Don't do all of this stretching. That's not going to do you any good. It's going to hurt you in the long run. Go out and run. Use good technique and enjoy it.